What's up, captains? So I wanted to try and do a quick video where we're going to cover not one, not two, but three meta decks that you can probably expect to see in some of the upcoming tournaments. Tournaments such as the Treasure Cup, or the tournament that I'm hosting this Sunday, January the 15th, called the Other Tournament. Very creative, I know. It's a 32-player tournament that I'm going to be co-casting with Blackbeard TCG, and we're both pretty excited about it. However, it's because of that tournament that this video is going to be a little different. It's going to go a little bit more quickly. It'll be lighter on the explanation and really just giving you a good foundation for what these meta decks can be. However, there's still a couple of different tweaks that you can do to the deck to make it feel like, you know, your own style. And that's one of the beautiful things about One Piece TCG, is that it does feel very pilot oriented, and so the more comfortable you are with a deck, the better you are going to do with it. So with all that said, I'd love to hear how you would make these decks your own down below in the comments. But anyway, what are we going to be covering today? So I'm going to start off with some blue Dopey deck, which is seemingly one of the more popular decks to play in the English scene. Then go into Kaido, who I think is not getting the respect that it deserves. And then finally, I'm going to do a red-green law deck that has a little bit more offensive firepower than the last one I tried to showcase. Plus, I ended up taking that down for a couple of different reasons, mostly because I think this deck that I'm going to showcase is better. But anyway, enough of that. Let's go ahead and jump right into the deck profiles. Alright, so starting with Dopey, this is actually a pretty unique deck because of Dopey's leader ability. So you do gotta attach 2 Dawn onto it, and then when you attack, you tap 1 more Dawn in your cost area in order to reveal your top card. And if it happens to be a 4-cost 7 Warlord, then you can play it onto the field, but it does come in tapped. Now, if you pair this with things like Character Dopey or Perona, you have a little bit of control when it comes to using this ability and trying to get the pieces out that you want to see. Now, when you hear that ability, one of the biggest concerns you probably are thinking about is the fact that the card you play is pretty vulnerable. But honestly, that's kind of alright, because it actually forces your opponent to make decisions. And in high-level competitive play, the more decisions you force your opponent to make, the more they gotta think, meaning the more variables and the more they might mess up. And the worst part is, if they choose wrong, you can really snowball from there. So what do we got in this deck? Well, first of all, we got 4 copies of Blocker Law, 3 copies of Perona, 4 copies of Alvida, who is a solid 2k counter and honestly can be a menace if set up early against a red deck, aka Goodbye Nico Robin. Then we got 4 copies of Blocker Dopey, 4 copies of Marshall D. Teach for some cheap bounce effects, 4 copies of Blocker Kuma because we're in the blocker meta, 4 copies of Boa Hancock, just plain old good, 4 copies of starter deck Gecko Moria for some of that 7 Warlord or Recursion, 4 copies of starter Mihawk. Now, we do got 2 copies of Pacifista. This is the 4-cost 6k attacker. Very strong vanilla, only topped by our 2 copies of Virgo. And honestly, I really do like Virgo because it is a very cost-effective way to potentially deal with 8-cost Kid or other high-powered threats. You still need to, attach some Dawn onto him to make him, go over the 8-cost Kid. However, it's a lot closer than some of our other lower-costed attackers. Then we got 2 copies of Starter Dopey, who once again just has a really powerful bounce effect that covers more cards, and then 3 copies of Mihawk. And this is the OP01 Mihawk, so the 9k attacker. Great anti-8-cost Kid card in terms of being able to swing into it. And its ability is essentially removal because it puts a 7-cost or lower character into the bottom of the deck, meaning they're most likely never going to see that card again. Rounding out our list, we do have event cards, 2 copies of Overheat, and then 4 copies of Love Love Mellow, just to keep our hand fresh. So that was our blue Dopey deck. Next up, let's talk about Kaido. Alright, so the thing is about Kaido, it honestly operates a lot like it did in the deck limited battles. Essentially, find Onigashima, prosper. But now there's some added tools, namely more removal effects that really allow you to control your opponent's board. But even with things like OP01 ulti, which is the ramp ulti, the biggest critique for this deck, especially in a best of 1 format, is the fact that it's very Onigashima reliant. But still, I think it's a very powerful deck, one that I haven't seen a whole lot of hype around, maybe because it was very hyped in the Japanese meta, and we just didn't want to, play into the meta like that, right? But still, let's take a look at the deck. So starting us off, we do have 4 copies of Starter Black Maria. This is our cheap blocker. 3 copies of OP01 ulti, aka ramp ulti. Just in case for some reason we don't see our Onigashima early, this still allows us to ramp a little bit. 4 copies of Old Lady Kurozumi. This is the Old Lady blocker. Sorry, that's like the best way I can describe her. 3 copies of the starter Who's Who can, delete a small costed character. Sorry, delete is a Digimon term. KO is what I meant. 4 copies of Sasaki. 4 copies of Starter Ulti, and then 4 copies of X Drake, giving us altogether a very solid count of 12 2K counters. Next up, we do have 4 copies of Blocker Queen. This also allows us to get a little bit more draw power. 4 copies of OP01 King for removal. You can use the Starter King here. However, I do like the idea of KOing, a small blocker as well as a potential attacker, such as Nico Robin or Okiku. Next up, we do have 2 copies of Fukurokuju, which is intended to do battle with a cost Kid. So he is a vanilla, which means he is cheaper to play than most 8K characters. This is just a very effective way of trying to get rid of Kid. Next up, we do have 2 copies of Rush Kaido for fast hits, and then 2 copies of Board Wipe Kaido for wide hits. And then finally, going into the events, we do have 4 copies of Blast Breath, which honestly feels like a must in any sort of purple deck. 2 copies of Thunder Bagua, and then finally 4 copies of Onigashima. So that was our Kaido deck. Let's go ahead and jump into the last deck profile for this video. Alright, and last I did want to talk about Red Green Law. So he is a red green deck that starts off with 4 life as opposed to the 5 like those other monocolor leaders. However, that's made up by his offensive prowess. And yeah, we still got to be wary about our life. So we did load up this thing with blockers like Beige and Killer. Is it Beige or Beigey? I don't know. Someone let me know in the comments. Anyway, we've loaded up with blockers like Beige and Killer. Then we do have our offensive core that comes in the form of Rush Zoro and Rush Luffy, who can actually go in and out of battle thanks to our leader and character laws abilities of Shambles. So what do we have for the deck? Let's start off with the 4 copies of Otama, who is a 2K counter, and the other half of the Jet Pistol combo that is meant to take down 8 cost Kid. Then next up, we got 4 copies of Beige, 4 copies of Bonnie, who's a fantastic searcher, 3 copies of Searcher Nami, who will find all of our Straw Hats, 4 copies of Blocker Killer, and then 4 copies of Izo. So even though he isn't a supernova, I actually prefer this over Scratchman of Pooh because Izo's ability can actually be replayed multiple times thanks to our Law Shambles abilities. So even though it isn't searchable and sometimes we might accidentally bottom deck one of them, with 4 copies, hopefully we'll be able to get one into our hands kind of naturally, and then eventually just be able to spam that ability. Next up, we do have 4 copies of the Promo Luffy. This is the 3 cost 2K counter that came with the store tournament packs. Overall, I think it's just a solid 2K counter. And then next up, we have 4 copies of Nico Robin. So here's another change that I made from the previous deck list. And honestly, I think that this just provides some great board removal, especially against a mirror matchup. Then we got 4 copies of Rush Zoro to punch things fast. 3 copies of Blocker Law for some additional Shambles effects, and then 3 copies of Rush Luffy just to punch things faster. And last but not least, we do have 3 copies of 8 cost Kid, just because in OP01 he's too good not to include. And then we do have a couple events here, so 2 copies of Punk Gibson and then 4 copies of Jet Pistol. And there we have it, 3 meta decks for you to test out and explore. I think the beautiful thing about the game is that there are a couple different ways that you can build these decks, so I'm excited to see how you take it, so let me know down in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful while you're down there, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel for more One Piece TCG content. And if you want to see more deck profiles like this, be sure to click this video here. But that'll do it for me, so captains, remember, build what you like, play what you love, and I'll catch you on January 15th for the other tournament.